All right, let's start again. G'day, how are we doing? Right. So good morning. So my name is Dr. Kelly Page. As Matt was saying, I've spent over 20 years studying educational innovation and learning in our schools, not just here in America. I started my career in Australia. It took me to the UK and Europe, and about 9 years ago I immigrated here to the US, to Chicago. I was working with some professors out of Northwestern and working in CPS schools, private independent schools, charter schools, to really get a sense of actually what's going on the ground in our schools and what do we need to start looking at differently to start to redesign learning. Now, I'm a social design ethnographer. To give you a little bit of a background on that, just very briefly, in short, I study people and culture of the living. As opposed to of the dead, we go into schools really interested in language, stories, conversations, and what's happening on the ground, and how we can best understand change and where there might be need for culture change. I'm also an action researcher. Often you don't see the two together, but that means that after I study a culture and a people in an organization, I like to stick around and implement some of the recommendations that came out of the research so that we can see actual change that's happening. So relative to my work looking at learning in schools, it's very much about, for me, living in the field. I invite public policy educators, people who, for example, write government, different laws, legislations, common core standards, people who are not necessarily in the field, to step away from the computer, step out of their offices, and actually get into the classroom. If you truly want to see where innovation is happening and how our children are learning, that's the only place you're going to learn it. I'm also going to ask you to put down the data that is in standardized test scores that I believe is highly inaccurate in what it's reporting based on what we see and what's happening. It's an inaccurate measurement of learning and innovation for most countries, and it's highly biased and highly skewed. So good morning. So my name is Dr. Kelly Page. As Matt was saying, I've spent over 20 years studying educational innovation and learning in our schools, not just here in America. I started my career in Australia. It took me to the UK and Europe, and about 9 years ago I immigrated here to the US, to Chicago. I was working with some professors out of Northwestern and working in CPS schools, private independent schools, charter schools, to really get a sense of actually what's going on the ground in our schools and what do we need to start looking at differently to start to redesign learning. Now, I'm a social design ethnographer. To give you a little bit of a background on that, just very briefly, in short, I study people and culture of the living. As opposed to of the dead, we go into schools really interested in language, stories, conversations, and what's happening on the ground. But we're going to get to that. So relative to living in the field, I very much take a learner-centered approach to learning. I focus on what learners want and need, not what educators or professors or public policy people think we should be doing. I like to listen to the conversations, and usually when I do my work, I'm not on a stage. I'm hanging out in classrooms. I'm sitting on circles with kids for morning classroom. I'm helping out with projects. Or I could be talking to partners to try and bring individuals into our schools to help us innovate and do things differently. So it's quite interesting to look at this from the point of an approach to learning, which is called inquiry-based learning. And inquiry-based learning leads with questions. And those questions obviously usually emerge from the experience in the schools, in the organization. And I'm going to share with you today a number of questions that have emerged from my work that I use to explore the conversations and really listen on the ground to my educators and to my children. Most of my work is very much focused in the last 8-9 years on pre-K through to grade 12. However, prior to that, I was a university professor, and my actual background is in adult education, and my PhD was studying the knowledge and learning of coders and developers of technologies. So it kind of runs the gambit. But this is an example. These are some pictures that have been taken from some of the schools, and predominantly one school I'm in right now, which is a Reggio-inspired project-based learning school that is actually regarded as a startup in Chicago. It's been going for 6 years, and it's called Bennett Day School. Now, Reggio Emilia's approach to learning is, it's out of Italy. It was founded in 1945 after World War II, and a community came together and they wanted to see learning as different. They wanted children to understand the importance of relationships, of community, of creativity, of collaboration. So they founded an approach to learning called Reggio Emilia, and actually the only schools that actually do true Reggio Emilia are in the town of Reggio. Every other school, and people have traveled across the world to visit this town in Italy to study how they do what they do, and then have used that learnings to inspire Reggio in other countries. So I can ask you how many schools in America are Montessori in our early childhood and how many are Reggio? And you probably wouldn't be able to tell me. But you might be able to tell me how many public schools we have and how many charter. We define our schools more by their funding models than their approaches to learning. And that's a problem. We need to focus more on what schools are for, and that is their learning models. Reggio, for example, our school is Reggio inspired, and that means that we use and adopt a lot of the principles, but we don't just do it in pre-K. We believe the Reggio model can be used not just in early childhood, but right through to grade 12 and into adult and educator development and training. And so in this school, once again, hanging out, sitting in the classrooms, Reggio honors also what we call multiple languages. We see children as having over 100 different languages that they communicate, share, and learn through. It's not just non-verbal and verbal communication styles. It's not whether you're left brain or right brain. It's not dyadic like that. It's very much based on over 100 different languages, and you can find the book on 100 languages on Amazon if you'd like to know more. But relative to Reggio as an approach to learning as well, it's very much project-based learning. And the children are seen as equitable to their teachers in their knowledge and learning. So in the classroom, both are considered learners. And they design their curriculum together. And so the children feel very empowered in the learning process and the learning experience. It's not educator as expert, educator as all-knowing, or teacher as all-knowing. And none of our classrooms are structured like they were designed over 100 years ago, where the tables obviously face the front of the room and it's set up for direct instruction. Everything is in circles, in squares, and it's about collaboration. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk you through a number of the questions and some of the insights that have come out of this work. Now, in ethnography and action-based research, we use a lot of questions that are phrased, how might we? It's not how should you or how could we, but how might we do this differently? So we're looking at how might we actually design and redesign our learning in our schools so that we're set up for success, so that our children are developing in ways that perhaps we never developed in, around relationships, collaboration, and creativity. Now, the key questions that I'm asking here is things like, how might we redesign learning and the experience of learning? How might we invest in it differently? How might we think of learners differently? And lastly, how might we evaluate learning? Not test it or test for it, but how might we evaluate it? And lastly, I'm going to give you a couple of things around innovation that you can do in your schools right now to start to plant the seed to change how we consider learning. So the first is what truly matters. A lot of the narrative on learning in schools is focused on test scores, firstly. So that's like putting the cart before the horse. So I'm going to put that to side, and I'm going to come back to that later. What really matters is how we learn, then what we learn, and next is around how we are set up for success in our learning. So firstly, in how we learn, we actually don't learn very well through direct instruction. Yet, most of our schools, our classrooms, our universities are set up in lecture style and are set up for direct instruction, where a teacher walks in the room and for 5 to 6 hours they will lecture at you, or they'll take you through worksheets of what they think you should know. And that style of learning really only helps us around 10 to 15% of the time. We're actually seeing a movement away from that, and a movement through a way of learning that's more collaborative, and it's called project-based learning. And in project-based learning, we are designed in such a way that you are collaborating, you're sharing, you're asking questions, you're helping to design the project and the curriculum. With our high schoolers, for example, they help design the curriculum every trimester. So they go out into the city of Chicago, and they did this for the first trimester this year, and they explored the city, and they walked away with lots of questions. And it was the questions of the students and the teachers together that they then mapped on a grid, humanities versus STEM, quant versus qual, to help design what their curriculum was going to be for the first semester. And it actually came out to be around the shape of Chicago, in terms of immigration, in terms of migration, in terms of our waterways, our transportation system. So the students were studying chemistry and physics and mathematics embedded within the project. But they felt empowered in the learning because they helped design it. They also were very big advocates of how they could actually build their projects, create things, as well as do essays, as well as have tests. So that whole empowerment of learning, project-based learning, is something we're seeing a lot of growth in innovative schools. Difficulty with public schools is how they're highly structured and don't allow for much creativity and freedom. So we're seeing public school teachers trying to adopt project-based learning in classes, within chemistry, within English, within the humanities, but it's a very important style of how we learn and how we work. Creative thinking, critical thinking skills, looking at fiscal and financial thinking, these are all hows and ways of learning that we really have to prioritize more in our schools than the domains of learning of what, whether it be math or science or so forth. The last thing around how we actually set up for success in our learning. Most of our learning models and the domains of learning in our schools are actually set up for inequity. They are designed for white men and white boys to be successful. They are not designed for women, and they are not designed for people of color. So we need to totally redesign what success looks like in our classrooms so that it has multiple lenses and is highly equitable, so that we have multiple conversations and people at the table in the design of that learning experience. Unfortunately, we're still working on a very old model in our classrooms, and so therefore, only certain people are successful. The other thing is the funding models in our classrooms. Also highly inequitable. But I'm going to get to investment a little bit later on. So what's most important is how we learn, then what we learn. Next is how might we consider learners differently? Now I came to this, now you've got to remember I was trained as a university professor. You stood up in a lecture hall in front of 300 people and you lectured at people. I went through a number of years of total retraining to actually see that in a classroom and learning environment, you are dealing with people where both are learners and teachers, right? Both a student and teacher in that environment. The minute you put a hierarchy in place, not only are you putting a lot of stress and pressure on the teacher or the professor to be as expert, but you're also disempowering children and students that their knowledge or their experience doesn't matter as long. So when I worked at the Illinois Math and Science Academy, which I was there for about 3 years, and it's the leading STEM math and science academy in the state of Illinois, it's a state-based organization. It's not a high school, it's not a university. It takes the top 650 math and science students in the state. They get free room and board, it's a boarding school. And in this environment with these math and science students, we had an innovation center. Yet it wasn't highly used. They spent $2.5 million on this space, and most of the programs in the space were about entrepreneurship. When I took over the space, the first thing we did was change the language of how we spoke and talked about our learners. Instead of it being students and teachers, and at IMSA, 65% of the teachers have PhDs. So there's a real interest in hierarchical imbalance that is often perceived that the students don't know as much as the teachers. So what we did in the Innovation Center, we took out the language of student and teacher, and everyone was a learner. And when you came into the Innovation Center, you could specify your identity yourself. Were you an innovator, an entrepreneur, a creative, a maker, an artist, a musician? It was totally up to you as to what your role was. It was a game changer for the Innovation Center because suddenly what happened, the students felt empowered, or the teachers felt empowered, and we had far more collaboration because you could self-identify. At Bennett Day School, we take this a step further. Our children as young as pre-K right through to high school are coding apps. When I learnt about the school and learnt that kindergarten students were working with a game company out of New York City that made digital learning games and the students were helping to code and develop it, I was like, they're 5. How does this work? So I studied and I observed, and it's really interesting to see the empowerment that happens when young children feel that they are developers and designers and entrepreneurs, not just little people, students in a classroom. The story of that, we helped develop, everyone here heard of Osmo? Osmo is a digital learning experience for children with iPads using tangibles. So they very much look at their motor skills as well as their critical thinking skills or their creativity. We were at the Toy and Game Fair because we helped develop an app called Osmo Kaleidoscope. And our kindergarten kids in our test lab or our tinkering lab helped design and develop it. They worked directly with the software engineers, telling them what they liked and didn't like on the screen. They weren't just testing it, they were developing it. And we were at the Toy and Game Fair and we were showcasing Osmo Kaleidoscope, and parents were coming out with the children. And what happened was I had one of the engineers there who hadn't worked with us, he was new to Osmo. And as these children came around the corner, he actually said to the student, "Oh, have you heard of Osmo?" And this little boy who was 6 turned to him and went, "Yeah, I developed it." And it was the most empowering thing I've ever seen. So changing the game for learners is changing the language. We're not students and teachers, we're all students and teachers actually, to be a fact. And that changes the nature of the power dynamic that occurs in the classroom. So the next thing is, how might we demonstrate, observe, and document learning? This is critically important. At our school, for example, every student has a digital portfolio. From the day they enter the school, we're taking photographs, video, we're documenting their learning in narratives, as well as with certain metric-based indicators or scores as to their learning over time. Learning is an action, and it's also only evident longitudinal. You have to watch it over time change and develop in learning. That's why most standardized tests are inaccurate, because they don't measure learning over time. They're just at one point in time, once a year. And so by demonstrating learning, we share it through what we say, what we do, what we create, the learning assets, be it an essay, be it a project, be it a presentation. So what we do is our students from 5 years of age are developing portfolios just like you do in the workplace. So that by the time they get to middle school or upper school, they have a portfolio that shows their competency, their skills, their projects they've worked on, and we evaluate their learning as to whether they've expressed and demonstrated their competencies. We don't test them on knowledge. It's very, very different. These portfolios are also transferable. We're seeing change in our higher education system with 25 of the leading Ivy League schools looking at moving away from standardized test scores as a way to get in, to actually portfolios to differentiate students. So it's important that learning has a multitude of data points. As an ethnographer, insight can come from anywhere. It can come from surveys, it can come from conversations, interviews, presentations. In this room, there are multiple data points I could actually study to get a sense of the culture and the people here. We need to do the same in learning to truly understand the complex nature of how learning occurs. How might we invest in what matters? Most people say to me, well, that's all well and good if you're a private school and you can afford it, right? Investing in what matters is critically important. We need to truly understand the business model of school. There is a business model, but unfortunately it's poorly executed. When I talk to most school leaders, I ask them, how much does it cost to run a classroom? And often they can't tell me. And I'm like, that's something we need to look at in any organization, whether you're a non-profit or a for-profit. Most charities, for example, can tell you what percentage in the dollar goes to the charity and what goes on costs. Yet we can't do that in our education system, especially in our public schools. We need to understand what is being spent on actual learning, instruction, teachers, and what is being spent on other costs, and is that necessary? From technology to administration to maintenance of buildings. We need to have a very complex financial model to understand where the money is going. That helps us understand the investment. The other thing is also thinking about money differently in schools. In higher education, for example, the average professor salary is $73,000 and above. In schools, The average salary is $60,000 for a teacher across this nation, with the starting salary at $40,000. The difference in higher education, your face-to-face contact with students is 6 to 12 hours a week. How much do you think the contact hours is in K-12? 6 to 7 hours a day of physical contact. So for a teacher, they have no development time in their school day. The average teacher, though, spends 12 to 16 hours a day working, whether it be grading at home, preparing projects, volunteering at the school, and they have very little time to actually do professional development, research, explore different ways of learning. Yet in universities, our professors do. So there's a big disparity in how we value education in universities than how we do in K-12. Another key thing about that, though, when we think about it, higher education has far more revenue streams than K-12. Most schools will rely, if they're public, on public funding or grants or donors to fund education and especially innovation programs. Whereas in higher educations, there's more revenue streams. I actually think we can turn that around and actually look K-12 differently. In terms of, for example, has anyone here heard of Play School? Yes? Yeah? So Play School is a suite of innovation learning tools and technologies and toys that was invented by 2 teachers out of Milwaukee. 2 teachers came up with the idea of these wooden toys. Oh, wow, I'm on 20 minutes. Anyway, wooden toys for education. They went to a lumber company and they helped make those wooden toys. They became so successful, the lumber company actually created a whole division called Play School and grew that toy business into a $1 million company that was then acquired by Hasbro. How much money do you think the teachers or the school that invented it actually got out of that agreement? Very little. The IP was actually acquired by the lumber company and then sold to Hasbro. So it's an interesting, there are a lot of innovations in our schools that aren't being commercialized that could be if we look at them differently. So lastly, how might we evaluate our learners? We need to step away from test scores or look at them differently. Evaluating learning in our school happens over time. It happens through a number of different metrics and systems, including test scores, but that's just one way to evaluate learning. We also need to do it through presentations, demonstrations, and a number of different aspects of how we evaluate where our children are, because learning is about growth, it is about change. If you're not evaluating learning over time, it's a broken system of design. So most people say to me, and actually Matt and I have this debate all the time, is relative to our standardized test scores. Instead of questioning the knowledge and learning of children and the performance of their teachers in getting them over the line and having America ranked more highly, can we first question the design of the tests? Critical thinking test, for example, the CWRA Plus that is administered at high school occurs over 3 hours and is hundreds of multiple choice questions. The MAP test that is done in middle school to high school, very similar design. Most of them are done at one point in time and don't give us a true representation of how children change or learners change over time. And when our teachers don't have the space to innovate and develop, there isn't innovation, there isn't a culture where we can see that growth, especially in our underfunded schools, in our poorer communities, because of how education is funded in America, based on property taxes, as opposed to based on the number of children you have in your school, which is how it is funded in Australia. So very lastly, how might we design learning in our schools? I'm going to take you through 3 points. First and foremost, we need to change our focus. America is ranked at the bottom in terms of investment in innovation and R&D in education in the world in the latest OECD report. And what we need to do is invest in, firstly, the role of an innovator or a director of innovation or something in our schools and our districts who is independent of the hierarchy of the school, who can actually start to advocate for teachers and advocate for change. We also, when we think of our teachers, to me, our educators are actually the most creative, innovative, and entrepreneurial people in the world. I have seen teachers pivot on a dime when they've got 40 students around them asking different questions. You ask an entrepreneur who's building a startup to do that, and they'll struggle. Teachers innovate, they're creative, and they're bringing new change in that classroom environment, and honestly, sometimes at their own penny. For example, Most teachers spend anywhere from $1,000 to $2,000 a year out of their own money on resources, supplies, and experiences for children. So we need to invest in teachers and pay them more, equivalent to what we do in higher education. And lastly, we need to start to see schools as labs of innovation, not schools. These are places where we're experimenting, pivoting, and learning in different ways. The only way we can actually move the needle on learning in education is to change how we see our schools and see them as the truly innovative spaces that they are. So that's a little bit of background around learning innovation in schools. Thank you very much. Enjoy the rest of your day.